"I won't raise a failure," my father yelled, and threw my report card away. I cried myself to sleep. At my doctorate ceremony, I saw him in the crowd, tears in his eyes. I said, "I guess failures do get PhDs." Ethan Carter had always been a quiet boy. At 12 years old, he moved through life with the sort of wide-eyed wonder that made him endearing to his teachers and invisible to most of his classmates. He wasn't the kind of kid who disrupted class or raised his hand first. Instead, he preferred the back row, his notebooks filled more with doodles of spaceships and trees than with correct answers. He had a curious mind, but it often wandered beyond the structured boundaries of his school's lesson plans. To Ethan, learning was an exploration. To his teachers, it was a problem they couldn't quite solve. At home, the world was different. The rules were clear, the expectations even clearer. His father, Douglas Carter, had served in the Navy for over 2 decades and carried that same rigid discipline into civilian life. The floors had to shine, the lawn had to be trimmed, the house had to be quiet during reading hours, and above all, grades had to be excellent. Average, Douglas would often say, is a disease, and this house is not a hospital. It was a phrase Ethan had heard so many times it felt stitched into the wallpaper. Their home in suburban Ohio sat on a street lined with identical houses and familiar routines. The neighbors knew Douglas as the man who rose at 5 o'clock in the morning for his jog, who polished his car every Sunday, and who barely spoke more than a courteous nod. His wife, Linda, was softer in tone but rarely intervened. She managed the house with quiet efficiency, her presence a gentle buffer between father and son. Still, in matters of discipline, she deferred to Douglas. Ethan loved her, but even her calm voice couldn't undo the weight of his father's silence when things went wrong. And lately, things were going very wrong. Ethan had just received his end-of-term report card, and it was, by all standards of the Carter household, a disaster. He had scraped by in English and history but had stumbled badly in math and science. His grade in algebra was a D. The red ink on the report card felt like a wound. He hadn't meant to do poorly. He had tried, really tried, but the numbers never seemed to stay in his head the way stories or images did. Graphs blurred together, equations unraveled. No matter how many times he reviewed his notes, he couldn't make the concepts click. The day he brought the report card home, the weight of it burned in his backpack all afternoon. He had considered not showing it at all, just quietly hiding it under his bed, but he knew Douglas would eventually find out. The truth always had a way of surfacing in that house. When he finally handed it over, his father said nothing at first. He stood at the kitchen counter, reading the paper slowly, his jaw clenched. Ethan watched him, hands trembling slightly behind his back. The silence stretched long enough to be painful. Then came the explosion. Douglas crumpled the report card in one swift motion and tossed it into the trash. "I won't raise a failure," he said, his voice low but sharp as glass. "Is that what you want to be? Someone who gives up when things get hard? Someone who wastes their potential because they're too lazy to do the work?" Ethan tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't lazy. He just didn't understand it all. But how could he explain that to someone like his father, someone who had built his entire life on discipline and precision? He stared at the floor as his father continued, each word a blow he couldn't dodge. The lecture went on for several minutes, but Ethan barely heard it. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere quieter, trying to keep from breaking apart completely. That night, after dinner was eaten in silence and the dishes were scrubbed spotless, Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The hum of the house seemed louder than usual. He clutched his pillow tightly, willing the tears not to come, but they did anyway. Slow, quiet, and persistent. In the dark, he replayed the scene over and over, each time wishing he had said something different, something smarter, something that would have made his father understand. But he hadn't, and he didn't. All he had were the words his father left behind, echoing in his mind, "I won't raise a failure." Ethan didn't know what to do with that. It felt final, like a verdict. Still, somewhere deep beneath the hurt, something stirred. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something softer. A quiet, trembling resolve. If failure was what his father saw in him, then maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to prove him wrong. Not for revenge, not for praise. but because part of him still believed he could be more than what that report card showed. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But that night, through tears and whispered hopes, Ethan made a promise to himself. It was clumsy and fragile and without a clear plan, but it was real. And sometimes a promise made in the quiet can be louder than any shout. The morning after the storm had passed in the Carter household, the air was colder than usual, though the thermostat read the same. Ethan rose early, his body still weighed down by the ache of the night before. He moved through his morning routine quietly, brushing his teeth and pulling on his uniform without a sound. Downstairs, his father was already seated at the table, reading the newspaper with a steaming cup of black coffee in hand, like he did every morning. Nothing about his posture or expression suggested anything out of the ordinary, but Ethan felt the tension in every step he took. Douglas did not look up as Ethan walked past him to grab his cereal. He did not offer a greeting or a nod. Ethan had become used to his father's stern presence, but this felt different. It was as if Ethan had become invisible overnight, a specter drifting through his own home. His mother placed a glass of orange juice beside him and ruffled his hair gently, a gesture of silent support, but even her kindness could not shake the heavy silence surrounding the table. On the way to school, Ethan stared out the car window while Douglas drove in his usual straight-backed, two-hands-on-the-wheel manner. The radio played a soft jazz station, but neither of them said a word. Ethan opened his mouth twice to speak, both times thinking he might try to explain his grades, to tell his father how hard he had tried, how the numbers just never made sense no matter how many times he reviewed them. But each time, he stopped himself, afraid of the response he might get. It was easier to sit in silence than to risk hearing the word failure again. At school, everything felt louder. The hallways buzzed with conversation and footsteps, lockers slamming shut, friends calling each other across the corridor. Ethan moved through it all like someone underwater. He avoided eye contact, walked with his head down, and slipped into his first period class just before the bell rang. His mind was still replaying the moment his report card landed in the trash, the sound of crumpling paper still echoing in his ears. During lunch, Ethan sat alone. He had friends, or at least people he sometimes talked to during class, but none of them were close enough to notice that something had changed. They joked and laughed across the cafeteria while Ethan picked at his food. He kept glancing at the table where the honor roll students sat, kids who wore confidence like a second skin, who never had to worry about red ink or disappointing anyone. Ethan wasn't jealous of them exactly, but he felt a kind of distance from them, as though they lived in a different world he wasn't invited into. That night back at home, Ethan sat at his desk trying to do homework, but the words on the page refused to hold still. His mind kept drifting. He could hear his father's footsteps downstairs, the creak of the hallway floor, the low murmur of the evening news. He knew he should be studying, but the weight of the previous night clung to him like fog. He stared at his math textbook, its graphs and formulas like a foreign language. Eventually he closed it and sat back in his chair, feeling the quiet press in on all sides. Then, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. At first it was just scribbles, his name, the date, nonsense words. But then something took shape. A list. It wasn't a list of grades or goals or plans. It was a list of questions. Why do I always mess up math? Why does Dad only talk when I do something wrong? Is being smart the only way to be good? Can I still be something if I'm not what he wants? He stared at the list for a long time. Then he added one more line, written in bigger, shaky letters. I'll show him I'm not a failure. It was a quiet declaration, barely more than a whisper in his mind. But in that moment, something shifted inside Ethan. Not anger, not resentment, just a small ember of determination. It did not yet have shape or direction. It didn't come with a plan or a guarantee, but it was real. And in that house, under that roof, a silent promise was sometimes the only kind of hope that could survive. That weekend, Ethan made a decision. He started spending his afternoons at the library. It wasn't far from home, and it was quiet, peaceful in a way his house rarely was. There, surrounded by shelves of books and the soft hum of overhead lights, Ethan found something that had always escaped him in class. Time. Time to sit with problems. Time to make mistakes without feeling watched. He started checking out books on biology, mostly because he liked the pictures. The diagrams of cells and plants and organs felt more like stories than numbers. One book in particular caught his eye, a guide for young readers about the human body. He read it cover to cover twice in the same week. The librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, noticed. She was in her 60s with silver hair always tied back and a voice as gentle as a lullaby. She never asked why Ethan was there alone. She simply helped him find what he needed and occasionally set aside books she thought he might like. One afternoon, she handed him a brochure for a science fair happening in a few months. "You might enjoy this," she said, sliding it across the desk. Ethan took it slowly, eyes scanning the bright graphics and bold letters. He didn't say anything, but he tucked the brochure into his backpack. That night, he stared at it under his reading lamp. A science fair. Projects, presentations, learning for the sake of curiosity. Not just tests and grades. It sounded terrifying. It also sounded like a chance. He didn't know how to begin or even what topic to choose. But something about the idea stuck with him. For the first time in weeks, he went to bed thinking not about failure, but about possibility. That thought alone was enough to carry him into sleep more gently than the night before. Though his father had not spoken a kind word in days, though the report card still lay forgotten in the trash, Ethan had found a sliver of light in the dark. He didn't know it yet, but something had begun to grow inside him, not just the will to prove someone wrong, but the first flickers of a dream taking root. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began staying after school for tutoring sessions, arriving home later than usual with his backpack heavier, not just with books, but with a growing sense of pressure. The tutoring wasn't mandatory, but after a quiet word from his homeroom teacher and a signed permission slip from his mother, he found himself seated in room 214 every Monday and Wednesday. The sessions were quiet, focused, and sometimes frustrating. Math still felt like a foreign tongue, but with each repetition a little more of the fog lifted. Still, every improvement felt like moving a grain of sand with a spoon, slow, tedious, and easily undone. Douglas never asked where Ethan went after school. If he noticed the change in routine, he didn't say. Dinner remained silent, marked only by the sound of utensils and the occasional comment from the evening news. Ethan wanted to tell him, wanted to explain how hard he was trying, how he was choosing to stay after school, how he wasn't giving up. But the distance between them felt like a canyon, and each day it grew a little wider. Linda asked once how the tutoring was going. Ethan told her it was fine, and she smiled, brushing his hair with her fingers like she used to when he was younger. That small gesture stayed with him longer than the session itself. One Tuesday afternoon, a substitute teacher filled in for his usual math tutor. Ms. Reynolds, a new face in the building, had recently been hired as the school's part-time science specialist. Tall and soft-spoken with a calm authority, she introduced herself without the stiffness of other teachers. Instead of jumping into drills or worksheets, she asked Ethan what exactly confused him about the subject. No teacher had ever framed the question that way before. Not, "What did you get wrong?" but, "What doesn't make sense yet?" Something about her tone made Ethan feel safe enough to answer honestly. "It's like everyone else sees the pattern, and I only see pieces," he said, embarrassed. "I try to remember steps, but they all blur together." She didn't correct him or sigh the way some teachers did. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully and said, "Sometimes it's not about seeing the whole puzzle right away. Sometimes it's about learning how to hold the pieces long enough to understand how they connect." That simple response stayed with Ethan long after the session ended. When he returned on Wednesday, she was back again, filling in. By Friday, she was officially assigned to his tutoring group once a week. Her lessons had a different energy. She didn't rely only on drills, but used real-world examples, science analogies, and even storytelling to explain abstract concepts. Though Ethan still struggled, he began to feel a sense of connection, not just to the material, but to learning itself. It was during one of these sessions that Ms. Reynolds introduced a side project for students interested in the upcoming district science fair. She passed out flyers and spoke about it like it was more than just an academic task, as if it were a chance to explore, to create, to be curious. Ethan took the flyer home, folded carefully in the front pocket of his backpack. That night, as he sat at his desk, he unfolded it and stared at the details. The date, the categories, the rules. His eyes kept returning to one section, life sciences. It reminded him of the book he had read at the library about the human body. A flicker of interest stirred. At dinner, he considered mentioning it but stayed quiet. Across the table, Douglas barely looked up from his meal. The silence that used to feel like a wall now felt more like a void. Linda filled the space with small talk about groceries, weather, and a neighbor's new dog. Ethan nodded along, wondering if either of them would notice if he disappeared into the science fair and never came out. He finished his meal in silence and went upstairs, the flyer still folded in his back pocket like a secret. The following week, he stayed after class to ask Ms. Reynolds about project ideas. She smiled, clearly pleased by his interest, and suggested a simple experiment involving plant biology, something hands-on, something he could understand not just with equations, but with observation. She helped him outline a plan to test how light exposure affects plant growth. It was small, manageable, and to Ethan's surprise, interesting. For the first time, he felt like he was doing something not because he had to, but because he wanted to see what would happen. He spent the next few days gathering materials, soil, pots, seeds, a lamp borrowed from the attic. He cleared a spot in his room and labeled 3 containers. Each day, he tracked growth, measured differences, took notes, and even photographed the changes. He found himself looking forward to those moments after school, where for half an hour he could focus entirely on something growing under his care, something he controlled. The project wasn't perfect. One pot developed mold, another showed uneven sprouting. But Ethan was learning more from the failures than he had expected. The tension at home didn't ease. Douglas remained distant, his conversations clipped and limited to reminders about chores or rules. When Ethan finally built up the courage to mention the science fair, the response was lukewarm at best. "It's not real school," Douglas said without looking up from his newspaper. "Make sure you're passing the subjects that matter." Ethan nodded, swallowing the disappointment. He didn't argue. He just returned to his room and wrote another entry in the small notebook he had started keeping, notes about the plants, the results, and sometimes thoughts he didn't want to say aloud. That Friday, Ms. Reynolds asked if she could visit the fair to support her students. Ethan hesitated, but then nodded. She had become more than a teacher. She was someone who saw him as more than a grade, someone who believed he had something to say, even if he didn't know how to say it yet. The fair was still weeks away, but already Ethan was beginning to feel a shift. The silence at home hadn't changed. The weight of his father's expectations still hung in the air, but within him, a quiet confidence was beginning to form, not loud, not certain, but present, like the first roots of a seed breaking into the soil. The days leading up to the science fair passed quickly, filled with quiet anticipation and long hours tending to Ethan's plant experiments. His bedroom had become a makeshift laboratory, the windowsill crowded with pots, notebooks, and measuring tools. He tracked the growth of each plant with precision, documenting patterns in a detailed log Ms. Reynolds had encouraged him to keep. For the first time in a long while, he felt the stirrings of pride, not just because he was doing something right, but because he understood what he was doing. It was not about memorizing facts or regurgitating answers. It was about observing, testing, and learning in a way that felt meaningful. He had found something that made sense in a world that often didn't. When the morning of the fair arrived, Ethan was nervous but quietly hopeful. He packed his presentation board, photos, and samples carefully, making sure everything was in perfect order. Linda offered to drive him to the school early, and although Douglas said nothing, he didn't object. The silence had become expected by now, like static between radio stations. As they drove, Ethan stared out the window, rehearsing what he might say to the judges, trying not to imagine his father's voice in the back of his mind, dismissing it all as a distraction. The gymnasium had been transformed into a maze of tables, colorful displays, and eager students arranging their projects. Ethan found his assigned spot near the back of the room and began setting up. His hands shook slightly as he placed his materials and straightened his board. Ms. Reynolds arrived shortly after, walking the room with a clipboard and a warm smile. When she reached Ethan, she looked over his setup and nodded. "You've done good work," she said, her tone gentle but sincere. "No matter what happens today, remember that. This is just the beginning." Ethan didn't say much, just a quiet thank you, but her words anchored him. As the judges made their rounds, stopping at each table, Ethan watched nervously, adjusting small details, rehearsing his opening line again and again. When they finally reached him, he launched into his explanation, careful to speak clearly, pointing out how light exposure had affected plant growth in each of the 3 environments he'd tested. The judges nodded, asked questions, and took notes. He answered as best he could, occasionally glancing at Ms. Reynolds, who stood near the entrance with folded arms and a calm expression. Her presence reminded him that he wasn't alone in this, not entirely. At the end of the event, awards were announced. Ethan didn't expect to win, but when another student in his category took first place for a more elaborate chemistry demonstration, a small part of him still stung with disappointment. He didn't cry, didn't complain, but the weight of not being recognized settled in his chest. Ms. Reynolds found him as he packed up and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Winning isn't the only way to succeed," she said. "You planted something today. Trust that it will grow." Ethan smiled faintly and nodded, even though the words didn't quite reach his heart yet. On the drive home, Linda congratulated him, telling him she was proud, even if he didn't win. He thanked her, appreciating the gesture more than he could express. When they walked through the front door, Douglas was on the couch, television glowing in the dim room. He didn't turn around. Linda mentioned the fair casually, adding that Ethan had done well. Douglas grunted but said nothing else. That night, Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the mixture of emotions inside him. Pride, disappointment, a strange sort of numbness. He had worked hard, done something he never thought he could, and yet it felt incomplete. The absence of his father's acknowledgement wasn't new, but it still cut deep. A few days later, report cards were issued again. Though his grades had improved, especially in science, his math score remained low. He had managed to lift it from a D to a C, but in the Carter household, that wasn't a victory. It was a reminder that he still hadn't reached the bar his father had set. When Ethan handed over the report card, Douglas read it slowly and without expression. He didn't crumple it this time. He didn't throw it away. He simply placed it on the table and said, "So, you're still not serious about math?" Then he got up and walked away. That moment, quiet as it was, hurt more than the outburst weeks earlier. Silence had a way of leaving deeper bruises than shouting. Ethan stood there for a long time, looking at the paper, his fingers curling around the edge. He had expected something: disappointment, frustration, even indifference, but not that single sentence that dismissed all the effort he had poured into the last few months. The tutoring, the project, the extra hours, it had all come down to that one line. He wasn't serious. Ethan didn't cry that night. He didn't get angry. Instead, he opened his notebook and began writing again. Not about plants or light exposure or growth patterns, but about failure. What it felt like, what it sounded like, how it shaped you. He wrote pages and pages without stopping, not to explain himself to his father, but to understand himself better. He didn't realize it at the time, but those journal entries were the first steps towards something larger, something deeper than a grade or a contest. The next few weeks were harder. School felt more draining. He still went to tutoring, still saw Ms. Reynolds, but the spark he had felt before the fair had dimmed. He questioned everything: his intelligence, his value, his future. The silence at home stretched longer. The looks from Douglas, when they came at all, carried the weight of quiet judgment. Ethan started to withdraw, not just from his father, but from the hope he had briefly allowed himself to hold. One afternoon, he bombed a math quiz. He had studied for it, reviewed every example, even practiced late into the night, but when the questions stared back at him in class, his mind froze. Panic crept in, and the answers scattered. When the paper was returned with a bold red F at the top, it felt like a punch to the chest. He didn't wait for class to end. He asked to use the restroom, stepped into the hallway, and sat alone in the stairwell for what felt like forever. That evening, he didn't show the quiz to anyone. He hid it in the bottom of his backpack, unable to face another wave of disappointment. His mother asked how his day went. He mumbled that it was fine. His father didn't ask at all. Ethan spent the rest of the night staring at his textbook, not reading, just flipping pages, letting the noise of the television downstairs wash over him like static. The weight of that failure, though small in the grand scheme, threatened to crush the fragile foundation he had been building. It was his first real setback since trying to change, and it made him question whether change was even possible. Maybe his father was right. Maybe some people just weren't meant to succeed. Maybe trying wasn't enough. And yet, deep inside, even through the cloud of doubt, something remained. A quiet defiance. A sense that the story wasn't over. He didn't know how long it would take. He didn't know if he would ever get it right. But he wasn't ready to stop trying. Not yet. It was a Saturday afternoon in early spring, and Ethan found himself alone in the house. His mother had gone to visit a relative for the weekend, and Douglas was outside, trimming hedges with the same military precision he applied to every task. The hum of the electric trimmer buzzed through the open windows, a steady reminder of his presence. Ethan had originally planned to spend the day reviewing science notes, but his thoughts wandered too often for any serious studying. The weight of his recent failure still hung over him like a shadow, persistent and cold. Bored and restless, he decided to explore the attic. It wasn't a space he visited often. Douglas kept it mostly organized, as he did with every part of the house, but it remained dusty and dim, filled with boxes of forgotten decorations, old clothes, and yellowing stacks of newspapers. As Ethan climbed the narrow steps, the creak of the wood beneath his feet felt oddly comforting. Up here, there were no expectations, no tests, no tense silences, just old memories sealed in cardboard. He moved through the clutter slowly, not looking for anything in particular. His fingers brushed past old photo albums, broken tools, and the occasional out-of-season wreath. Toward the back corner, hidden beneath a blanket, he noticed a box labeled Douglas School Years. The handwriting was neat and blocky, clearly not his mother's. He hesitated for a moment before kneeling down and pulling the lid off. Inside were bundles of notebooks, faded certificates, and a few school pictures of a much younger Douglas, his expression already serious even in childhood. Curiosity overtook caution. Ethan dug through the papers, unsure what he hoped to find. Then, tucked beneath a stack of spiral-bound notebooks, he found a folder labeled Report Cards. His breath caught as he slowly opened it. Inside were sheets of paper from various grades, marked with familiar subjects, familiar columns, familiar comments in tidy cursive. But what shocked Ethan most were the grades. They weren't perfect, not even close. There were C's in math, occasional D's in science, and even a few comments from teachers suggesting difficulty focusing or a lack of participation. He blinked, reading one line over and over again. Douglas has potential, but struggles to apply himself in mathematics. Additional support may be needed. The words sounded eerily similar to the ones Ethan had heard about himself. He sat back, stunned. The image he had carried of his father, disciplined, unshakable, always in control, suddenly cracked. For years, Douglas had demanded perfection, as though it was something he had always achieved. He had spoken of failure as though it were a personal betrayal, something shameful and foreign. And yet, here was proof that he had once struggled too. The trimmer buzzed outside, still steady and uninterrupted. Ethan looked down at the report cards again, reading each one slowly. He wasn't sure what confused him more, the fact that his father had once failed, or the fact that he had hidden it so completely. Why had Douglas never mentioned this? Why had he chosen to become the enforcer of standards he himself had failed to meet? Ethan carefully placed the papers back in the folder, his mind racing with questions. He knew better than to confront his father directly. Any mention of the attic or the box would likely be met with cold dismissal or a sharp rebuke. But the discovery wouldn't leave him alone. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the man downstairs with the boy on those report cards. Was Douglas ashamed of his past? Had he buried his own struggles so deeply that he now punished Ethan for reminding him of them? Or was there something else, something darker, that made failure unbearable for him to witness in his son? Ethan didn't have the answers. He only had more questions, each one unraveling the image of his father a little more. At school, he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to the attic, the faded papers, the young Douglas whose academic journey had mirrored his own in ways neither of them had ever admitted. Ms. Reynolds noticed his distraction and asked if everything was all right. Ethan nodded quickly, not ready to share what he had discovered. She accepted his silence with a nod, but gave him a look that suggested she saw more than he was saying. The following weekend, Douglas called Ethan into the garage. There was a lawnmower to fix and he wanted help. They worked side by side in silence, the metal parts cold and rusted, the scent of oil thick in the air. At one point, Douglas said, "Pay attention. If you don't know how something works, you learn it. That's how you survive." Ethan wanted to say something then, to ask why Douglas had never shared his own learning struggles, why he had chosen to act like perfection was the only acceptable path. But the words never came. Instead, he tightened a bolt and nodded, his thoughts a whirlwind behind his quiet demeanor. Later, when Douglas wasn't looking, Ethan glanced again at his father's hands, strong, calloused, precise. They were the hands of someone who had built a life through control and effort, but somewhere behind them was a boy who had once failed math, who had once sat at a desk feeling the same shame Ethan had felt. That boy had grown into a man who would never admit it. That realization didn't bring comfort, it brought complexity. Ethan could no longer hate his father for being unfeeling. He saw now that the silence came from somewhere deeper, maybe even from pain. But understanding didn't make the distance between them disappear. It only changed its shape. Ethan returned to the attic once more that week, just to look at the box again. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Just knowing it was there, knowing the truth existed somewhere in that forgotten space, was enough to shift something in him. For the first time, he stopped seeing himself as weak for failing. He began to wonder if maybe failure wasn't the end of the road. Maybe it was just part of the journey, hidden, quiet, and real. As he stood there, surrounded by dust and silence, Ethan realized that the answers he sought might never come from his father's mouth. But the truth had found another way to speak, and now that he had heard it, he would never be able to unhear it. High school arrived with a strange blend of excitement and anxiety. Ethan had expected things to change, hoped for a fresh start, maybe even a chance to redefine himself outside the shadow of his earlier struggles. But the first week revealed just how rigid the system could be. On the second day, he was summoned to the guidance office, where a neatly dressed counselor greeted him with a tight smile and a clipboard filled with schedules. "We've placed you in general track for most of your core classes," she explained, handing him a printed timetable. "It's based on your academic history and standardized test scores." Ethan looked at the paper. General math, basic science, standard English. Every subject he had worked hard to improve was now defined by lower expectations. He wanted to speak, to argue that he didn't belong in those rooms, that he was still learning, still improving. But the counselor had already moved on to her next task, assuming his silence meant agreement. As he walked through the halls to his new classes, the realization hit him with full force. The school had already decided who he was, and once placed in that track, it was notoriously difficult to move out of it. Labels stuck, teachers taught differently. Assignments were easier, expectations lower, and students carried themselves as though they had already been told they wouldn't matter as much. The first few weeks were disheartening. In math class, students talked over the teacher. In science, they copied answers without understanding the content. Ethan did his best to focus, taking careful notes and asking questions, but it was clear he didn't belong there, not because he was smarter than anyone else, but because he actually cared, and caring made him different. The mocking started subtly. A few students noticed that Ethan paid attention, stayed behind to ask questions, and even carried extra books. One afternoon in the hallway, a boy named Derek snorted as Ethan passed by with a biology textbook tucked under his arm. "Hey, Einstein," Derek called out. "You studying for your Nobel Prize or just trying to make us look bad?" The other kids laughed, not cruelly but carelessly, as if Ethan's effort was a joke. He didn't respond. He kept walking, but the comment lingered. Every time he raised his hand in class or stayed after school for help, he felt those eyes on him, measuring, judging. It wasn't the kind of bullying that left bruises. It was quieter, more persistent. A constant reminder that trying too hard in the wrong place made you a target. At home, things remained unchanged. Douglas rarely asked about school. His interactions with Ethan were limited to reminders, corrections, or silence. Linda continued to support in the background, offering encouragement, but even she seemed unsure how to help now that Ethan was in high school. The distance between father and son had settled into a routine, unspoken and unmoving. Only Ms. Reynolds seemed to remain a steady presence in Ethan's life. Though she was no longer his tutor, she had transferred to the high school part-time and ran an after-school science club. One afternoon, she spotted Ethan walking past the lab and called out to him. "We meet Tuesdays and Thursdays," she said, gesturing to the students inside. No grades, no lectures, just science. Ethan hesitated but nodded. That following Tuesday, he entered the lab and found a small group of students gathered around a microscope. Ms. Reynolds welcomed him with the same warmth she always had. For an hour, he forgot about tracks and test scores. He measured samples, labeled slides, asked questions. The curiosity that had once bloomed in his middle school bedroom sparked again, even if only for a little while. Still, the science club didn't change how he was treated in class. Derek and his friends found new ways to mock him. Teacher's pet, the try-hard and nerd boy were whispered whenever he walked past. It wasn't violent, it wasn't loud, but it chipped away at him, day by day. Even students who once seemed friendly began to distance themselves. Nobody wanted to be seen siding with the kid who made everyone else look lazy. One afternoon, after a particularly rough day, Ethan came home and sat in the garage for over an hour. Douglas was out, and Linda was running errands. The quiet wrapped around him like a heavy coat. He didn't cry. He didn't even speak. He just stared at the workbench, thinking about the report cards in the attic, the boy his father once was, and the man he had become. The contrast unsettled him. Somewhere between those two versions of Douglas, something had hardened, and Ethan was afraid of the same thing happening to him. He started writing again, late at night, once the house had gone still. His notebook became a place not just for thoughts, but for questions, frustrations, and half-formed ideas. He wrote about the kids in his class, the invisible hierarchy that labeled them. He wrote about how effort had become shameful, how curiosity made you suspicious. He wrote about the boy who once believed he could change the way his father saw him and wondered if that belief had been naive. But even as he wrestled with these thoughts, he continued attending science club. Mrs. Reynolds noticed the change in his demeanor, how he smiled less, how he hesitated before speaking. One Thursday, after the session had ended, she asked him to stay behind. "You okay?" she asked gently. Ethan shrugged. "Just tired." She studied him for a moment, then said, "I know high school can be tough, especially when people expect you to stay in the lane they've chosen for you." He looked up. The words hit close to home. "But you don't have to stay there," she continued. "You're allowed to outgrow the labels they give you." Ethan didn't answer, but those words stayed with him. They echoed through the next week, through each class he sat in, through every hallway he walked alone. Slowly, they became a quiet mantra. He might not belong in the track they placed him in. He might not be understood by the kids around him, but he didn't have to accept the story they had written for him. He began studying harder, not to prove anything to Douglas or to win anyone's approval, but for himself, for the boy who once grew plants in his bedroom, for the student who loved the human body diagrams, for the person he was becoming. He didn't push back against the system, not yet, but he began building something within it. Knowledge, resilience, patience, the quiet tools of someone preparing to write a different ending. As months passed, Ethan began to transform in ways that weren't immediately visible to others. He still walked the same halls, still sat in the same classrooms, still bore the same labels on his schedule, but inside, something was shifting. He had grown tired of watching the world decide who he was supposed to be. Somewhere between the endless mockery, the quiet support from Ms. Reynolds, and the realization that the system had drawn conclusions about him too soon, Ethan started making deliberate choices to reclaim his path. He began spending his lunch breaks in the library, not because he had no one to sit with, though that was mostly true, but because the library had become a refuge. In its silence, he found the freedom to think clearly. He started reading beyond his assignments, choosing books about biology, chemistry, and medical science. What had once been an abstract interest was now evolving into a focused passion. The human body fascinated him. The complexity of systems working in tandem, the intricacy of cells and tissues, the mysteries of disease and healing, it all stirred something deep inside him. At the science club, he became more engaged. Ms. Reynolds noticed how his questions grew sharper, how his understanding deepened. She began giving him more advanced reading materials, sometimes even inviting him to sit in on small study groups with students from the honors track. Ethan never said no, even if he was nervous. He absorbed everything he could, treating each session like a stepping stone towards something he couldn't fully name yet, but was starting to believe in. One Thursday afternoon, after a club session, Ms. Reynolds pulled Ethan aside. She carried a brochure folded neatly in her hand. "I think you should apply to this summer program," she said. "It's hosted by a state university. 3 weeks of hands-on biology labs, lectures, and research exposure. It's competitive, but I'll help you with the application." Ethan took the brochure carefully, his eyes scanning the information. It sounded like something meant for students in advanced classes, students with straight A's and glowing recommendations. He glanced up, uncertain. "Do you think I can get in?" he asked quietly. She looked at him, her expression calm and steady. "I wouldn't have brought it to you if I didn't." That night, Ethan filled out the application slowly, typing each response with a level of care that surprised even him. He wrote about his struggles, his fascination with biology, and his desire to understand the body not just as a science, but as a story, something layered, complex, and worth studying. Ms. Reynolds helped him polish it, and they submitted it the following week. Meanwhile, Ethan began making a quiet but intentional push in his classes. He asked his teachers for extra assignments. He requested tutoring beyond what was offered. He stayed after school not only for science club, but for math help too. Slowly, the perception around him began to shift, not in grand dramatic ways, but in the way teachers paused when he raised his hand, in the nods of approval when he turned in carefully written essays, in the cautious respect from classmates who had once dismissed him. It wasn't all smooth. Derek and his friends still sneered from time to time, but their words no longer held the same power. Ethan had grown stronger, not just in knowledge, but in resolve. He had stopped trying to convince them he belonged, and instead focused on proving it to himself. One afternoon in April, while sorting through the mail, Linda handed Ethan a large envelope. His name was printed neatly on the front, just beneath the university's emblem. He stared at it for a moment, heart pounding, then opened it slowly. "Congratulations," the letter began. "We are pleased to offer you admission to our Summer Scholars Program in Biological Sciences." For a moment he couldn't breathe. The words danced in front of him, unreal and glowing. He read the letter twice, then a third time, before walking into the kitchen where his mother stood slicing vegetables. "I got in," he said, holding the paper out to her. She took it, eyes scanning quickly, and then pulled him into a hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You've earned this." Douglas was in the garage when Ethan stepped out to tell him. He was fixing a cabinet hinge, eyes focused, back straight. "I got accepted into a science program this summer," Ethan said, voice calm. Douglas didn't look up immediately. He adjusted a screw, tightened it, then finally turned to face him. "How much does it cost?" he asked. "It's covered," Ethan replied. "Scholarship included." Douglas nodded once. "Good." No smile, no congratulations, but also no dismissal. It wasn't the celebration Ethan had secretly hoped for, but it was something. A recognition, even if unspoken. In the weeks leading up to the summer program, Ethan prepared with unwavering focus. He read everything he could, practiced lab techniques online, and even started drafting ideas for future research. When the day arrived, Linda drove him to the university campus, tears in her eyes as she watched him walk into the dorms, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a dream that had refused to die. The program was more challenging than anything he had faced. The students were sharp, the professors demanding, but Ethan didn't fall behind. He stayed up late in the labs, asked questions in every lecture, and earned quiet respect from peers who had never heard of him before. For the first time, he was surrounded by others who loved science the way he did, who saw failure not as shameful, but as a necessary step toward understanding. At the end of the program, each student had to present a small research project. Ethan chose to study the effects of temperature on enzyme activity. It wasn't the most advanced topic, but he poured himself into it, using everything he had learned. When he presented, his voice was steady, his slides clear, and his conclusions sound. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was real. Back home, something had changed. He walked with more purpose. He studied not out of fear, but out of fascination. He was no longer the boy trying to escape failure. He was a young man running toward something greater, and though his father's silence remained, it no longer defined him. Ethan had found something louder than disappointment, his own voice, steady and growing stronger by the day. The summer program at the university had left Ethan invigorated and more certain than ever about the direction he wanted his life to take. Returning home had felt like stepping back into a smaller world, but he no longer viewed it as a trap. He had seen what lay beyond, and had begun to believe he could one day belong there, not just temporarily but permanently. That belief carried him through his junior year of high school with renewed drive. He enrolled in more rigorous classes, lobbied for entry into higher-level electives, and kept building the foundation for what he hoped would be his future in biomedical sciences. As college application season approached, Ethan sat at his desk for hours crafting essays that detailed his journey, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He wrote about being tracked into general classes, about the quiet resistance he mounted against lowered expectations, about the summer program that had redefined his goals. Every sentence was honest, stripped of pretense. He didn't exaggerate his achievements, but he made it clear how far he had come and how hard he had worked to get there. His top choice was a respected state university with a strong pre-med program. The campus had become a symbol to him, a place where science was alive, where ideas flourished, where students collaborated and questioned the world. He could see himself there, walking those halls, studying late in the labs, surrounded by peers who shared his curiosity. He submitted his application early, hoping to increase his chances. Over the following weeks, he sent out others as well, applying to a mix of state and private schools, but his heart remained tethered to that one. During that time, Douglas said little about Ethan's college plans. He knew applications had been submitted but never asked where or why. Linda, as always, was quietly supportive, helping Ethan gather transcripts, reminding him of deadlines, and reading over his essays with a mother's careful eye. Still, it was a process Ethan mostly navigated alone. Each application felt like a letter to the future, mailed with hope and no guarantee of reply. When the response finally came, it arrived in a thin envelope. Ethan had been checking the mailbox obsessively for days, his heart leaping every time he saw a university logo. That afternoon, he stood at the kitchen counter, hands trembling as he tore it open. The first sentence confirmed everything he had feared. "We regret to inform you." The words blurred after that. He stood still, staring at the letter as if by reading it again he could change its meaning. It wasn't just disappointment. It was a shattering. This was the school he had dreamed of, the one he had built his plans around. He had imagined himself in their lecture halls, working alongside students who understood him, who saw science not as a requirement, but as a calling. And now, with one thin envelope, that future was gone. He sat down at the table, the letter still in his hand. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. It felt like the air had been pulled from the room. Linda found him there a few minutes later. She read the letter silently, then placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said. "That doesn't mean it's over." Ethan nodded, but the words didn't reach him. He didn't tell Douglas right away. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he didn't want to see the look of confirmation, the unspoken suggestion that he had aimed too high. When he did finally mention it, Douglas simply said, "Did you apply anywhere else?" "Yes," Ethan replied. "I'm waiting to hear back." Douglas nodded, then returned to cleaning the yard tools. In the days that followed, more letters arrived. A few acceptances came through, mostly from smaller schools and community colleges. One university offered conditional admission based on further academic review. The rejections were harder, not because of what they said, but because of what they implied. That no matter how far he had come, it still wasn't enough. He had worked for years to climb out of the shadow of failure, only to be told, in subtle ways, that his efforts had not been sufficient. Ethan decided to enroll in a local community college. It wasn't what he had envisioned, but it was a place to continue learning, to stay on the path he had chosen. Ms. Reynolds, upon hearing the news, offered her unwavering support. "Great scientists come from everywhere," she said. "It's not about where you start. It's about how far you go." That fall, Ethan began classes. The campus was small, modest, and far from the energetic buzz of the universities he had once dreamed of, but he treated every course with the same intensity he had shown in the summer program. He studied late into the night, volunteered in the biology department's lab, and joined a student organization focused on healthcare careers. Slowly, he began to build a new version of his dream. He didn't share much about college life at home. Douglas rarely asked, and when he did, the questions were surface level. How are classes? Staying out of trouble? Ethan kept his answers short. Linda was more engaged, reading over his essays and tests, offering encouragement when he came home exhausted. But even her support couldn't erase the sting of rejection that still lingered beneath the surface. One evening, while clearing out his email inbox, Ethan found the original message from the university that had rejected him. He reread it slowly. For the first time, he noticed the last line. "We encourage you to consider reapplying in the future." The suggestion hung in the air. A door that wasn't completely shut. A window, perhaps, if he could find a way to climb through it. That night, he returned to his notebook. He hadn't written in months. The pages had once been filled with doubt and longing, frustration and hope. Now he opened a new page and wrote only one sentence. "This isn't where I stop." He didn't know yet what form his next move would take, but the words were enough. Enough to remind him that a setback, no matter how painful, wasn't the end. It was a detour. And though the road ahead would be longer than he had hoped, he was not lost. He was still moving, still learning, still becoming. Community college was not glamorous, but Ethan quickly discovered it could be transformational. He enrolled in his courses with a level of commitment that surprised even him. He took biology, chemistry, and introductory anatomy, all classes with heavy workloads and rigorous expectations. From the beginning, he approached them not as hurdles but as gateways. He studied early in the mornings before class and stayed late in the library at night, his notebooks filled with diagrams, hypotheses, and summaries. It wasn't just about passing. It was about understanding. He wanted to know why things worked the way they did, what caused diseases, how the human body healed, and how science turned mystery into knowledge. Midway through the first semester, he saw a flyer posted outside the Student Services office. A local clinic was seeking volunteers to help with administrative tasks, checking patients in, organizing paperwork, filing insurance documents. It wasn't research, and it wasn't medical work in the traditional sense, but something about it caught his attention. He applied that same afternoon and began volunteering the following week. The clinic was a small facility on the outskirts of town, serving a wide range of patients, many of them elderly, others uninsured, some immigrants navigating the complexities of healthcare in a new country. Ethan's job was simple but meaningful. He greeted patients, answered questions, and occasionally helped with translation apps when language became a barrier. He watched the nurses and doctors move through the halls with purpose. He listened to patients talk about their symptoms, their worries, their hopes. In those quiet moments, something awakened in him, a deeper understanding of what medicine could be. It was not just about science. It was about empathy. It was about paying attention to people who often felt invisible. One Thursday afternoon, while helping an older man fill out a form, Ethan remembered a conversation he had with Ms. Reynolds during high school. She had asked him why he was interested in science, and he had responded, "Because I want to know how things work." But sitting there beside that patient, watching his trembling hands and hearing the strain in his voice, Ethan realized the answer had changed. Now it was, "Because I want to help people who don't know what's happening inside their own bodies." The spark he had first felt during that middle school science fair came rushing back. The memory of planting seeds and tracking their growth had seemed so small then, but now, years later, he saw the connection. It wasn't the plants that had mattered. It was the process, the observation, the patience, the slow unfolding of life and knowledge. That project had introduced him to a language that didn't rely on numbers alone, a way of learning that gave shape to the invisible. Encouraged by that realization, Ethan began speaking with one of the clinic's physicians during slow hours. Dr. Hassan was in his late 50s, with a quiet demeanor and a sharp mind. When Ethan mentioned his interest in medicine, Dr. Hassan asked about his background. Ethan explained his community college path, his past academic struggles, and his recent discoveries. Dr. Hassan didn't judge. He simply nodded and said, "It's not the path that matters. It's the direction you're moving." Over the next few months, Ethan kept volunteering while continuing his studies. He began researching transfer options to four-year universities. He knew now that he wanted to study biology in depth, to eventually apply to medical school. The goal no longer felt like a fantasy. It was distant, yes, but it was clear. For the first time in years, Ethan saw his own story with a sense of structure. The rejection from his dream university had not destroyed his dream. It had redirected it. One evening, while reorganizing his desk, Ethan found his old notebook, the one he had filled with thoughts and questions during high school. He flipped through the pages, reading entries from nights when he had felt invisible, entries filled with confusion, frustration, and doubt. On one page he had written, "Maybe I'm not meant to succeed." Below that, in smaller handwriting, he had scribbled, "But maybe I'm meant to try." He closed the notebook slowly and looked out the window. The street was quiet, lit by the soft glow of porch lights. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the rumble of a train passing through the edge of town. He didn't feel lost anymore. He didn't feel like a failure. He felt like someone who had kept moving when it would have been easier to stop. Later that week, he received an email from the same university that had rejected him 2 years before. It was part of their outreach to community college students considering transfer. They offered an information session, a chance to ask questions, and the opportunity to meet with an admissions advisor. Ethan stared at the message for a long time before clicking to register. He wasn't sure if he would apply again, but something in him needed to return to that possibility. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to complete the sentence he had started years ago. When he told Linda about the email, she smiled and said, "You've already come so far. This is just another step." Douglas overheard the conversation but didn't say much. Later, though, as Ethan passed the living room, his father looked up from his chair. "You thinking about applying again?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "I am." Douglas gave a small nod in return. "If you do, give it everything you've got." The words were few, but they landed with weight. They weren't approval. They weren't an apology, but they were a shift, one that Ethan felt in his bones. As the semester neared its end, Ethan began compiling transcripts, recommendation letters, and essays for transfer applications. This time, when he wrote about his academic history, he didn't focus on the pain. He focused on the growth. He told the story of a boy who had once believed failure was permanent, who had discovered instead that persistence could rewrite his future. He wrote not as someone seeking validation, but as someone ready to contribute. He submitted the applications quietly, without ceremony. No dramatic announcements, just steady steps forward. And then he waited, not with desperation, but with purpose. Because now he understood something essential: the value of every detour, every disappointment, every time he had chosen to continue. It had all led him here, not by accident, but by design. The waiting was harder than Ethan expected. Even after all the work, the determination and the steady progress he had made, the silence that followed his transfer applications reopened old doubts. Each day that passed without a response felt like a test of patience and endurance. He poured his energy into studying, working harder than ever during his final semester at the community college. He maintained a near-perfect GPA and received glowing feedback from professors who had seen his commitment firsthand. But behind the focus and discipline, a quiet fear lingered. What if, despite everything, it still wasn't enough? When the first letter arrived, it came not by email, but in a thick envelope stamped with the seal of the state university he had once viewed as unreachable. His hands shook as he tore it open. Inside was a welcome letter, an official transcript request form, and a scholarship offer based on academic merit and service involvement. He read the letter twice, stunned, and then a third time just to be sure it was real. A quiet wave of relief and disbelief swept over him. The school that had once said no had now said yes. He told Linda first. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he walked in, holding the envelope as though it were something sacred. "I got in," he said, his voice tight with emotion. She turned quickly, eyes widening as she reached for the letter. As she read, tears welled in her eyes and she pulled him into a long, tight hug. "I knew you would," she whispered. "You've earned every word in this letter." Douglas was sitting in the living room when Ethan approached. He didn't hold the letter out. He didn't expect much. But he said the words clearly. "I got into the university. They offered me a scholarship." Douglas looked up from his newspaper, and nodded slowly. For a moment, Ethan thought that was all he would say. But then Douglas set the paper aside, leaned forward and spoke. "You didn't let the first no stop you, that's what matters." There was no elaborate speech, no long overdue apology. But those 2 sentences were enough, more than Ethan had received in years. They weren't just an acknowledgement. They were a recognition of what had been endured and what had been overcome. The transition to university life was demanding. The campus was bigger, the coursework more intense, and the expectations higher than anything Ethan had previously experienced. But he felt ready. He had built the habits, the resilience, and the discipline required to thrive. He enrolled in the biomedical sciences program and quickly stood out for his thoughtful questions, consistent effort, and collaborative spirit. He formed study groups, connected with faculty mentors, and began assisting in a campus research lab focused on cellular regeneration. For the first time, he wasn't catching up. He was moving alongside others who shared his passion. But just as he began to find his rhythm, the biggest challenge of his academic journey emerged. During his second year at the university, Ethan applied to several competitive graduate programs in biomedical research and medicine. He had spent months preparing his applications, crafting personal statements, gathering letters of recommendation, and documenting his clinical and volunteer experience. He submitted to programs across the country, knowing how fierce the competition would be. When the responses began to arrive, they were not what he hoped. One by one, emails landed in his inbox, each one a polite rejection or a notification that he had been placed on a wait list. The reasons were vague: limited capacity, overwhelming applicant pools, or simply after careful consideration. He stared at the screens, feeling the familiar sting of doubt return. It wasn't the outright denial that hurt the most. It was the uncertainty. Being waitlisted meant he was close, but close did not mean accepted. He had worked too hard and come too far to let his future slip through a crack. So he did what he had always done. He went back to work. He met with his academic advisor to identify weaknesses in his applications. He enrolled in advanced seminars to bolster his knowledge. He volunteered for additional lab projects, assisting graduate students with complex experiments and gathering data that would contribute to published research. He rewrote his personal statement, refining it to reflect not just his goals, but the journey that had shaped them. For 3 months, while his peers celebrated their acceptances, Ethan doubled down on his efforts. He knew that one last push might make the difference between waiting and being chosen. He applied to additional programs, expanding his reach but never compromising his standards. Every evening after classes and lab work, he returned to his apartment and studied, researched, and wrote. His days became a rhythm of purpose, proof to himself that he still believed in the path he had chosen. Then, one morning in early spring, a message appeared in his inbox. It came from one of the top doctoral programs in biomedical sciences in the state, one he had reapplied to after being waitlisted months earlier. The subject line was simple: status update. He clicked it with cautious hope. "Dear Ethan Carter," it began, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into our PhD program beginning this fall." The words blurred for a moment as a rush of emotions swept over him. Relief, triumph, gratitude. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for weeks. It had taken years of work, rejection, persistence, and resilience. But now, he was stepping into the future he had once only dared to imagine. He printed the letter and brought it home with him that weekend. He handed it to Linda first, watching her eyes widen again as she read. Then he walked into the living room where Douglas was watching the news. "I got into the PhD program," Ethan said. Douglas turned slowly, took the letter and read it in silence. When he finished, he looked at Ethan, his expression unreadable at first. Then, without a word, he stood and offered his hand. Ethan took it. For the first time, it didn't feel like a gesture of discipline or command. It felt like respect. Neither of them spoke, but neither needed to. The silence that had once separated them now held something else entirely: understanding. In that moment, Ethan realized that the biggest challenge he had faced wasn't just academic rejection. It wasn't even the years of silence or the weight of expectations. It was believing that he was allowed to define his future. And now, after everything, he had. The day of Ethan's doctoral commencement ceremony arrived quietly, without fanfare. The sky over the university was overcast, the air cool but still. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his gown with steady hands. The weight of the robe, heavier than he expected, reminded him of everything it represented: years of perseverance, sacrifices, long nights of research, and the countless moments when quitting would have been easier than continuing. As he walked toward the ceremony hall, memories began to surface with startling clarity. The image of his father tossing a report card into the trash, the long nights he cried into his pillow, the feeling of invisibility in high school corridors, the quiet encouragement from Ms. Reynolds, the science fair plants in his bedroom, the old report cards he'd found in the attic, the letter of rejection that nearly broke him, the countless steps it had taken to arrive at this very moment, each one carved out of determination, not luck. He took his seat among dozens of fellow graduates, all clad in the same black gowns and colored hoods. Around him, families filled the rows of seats in the auditorium, mothers with tearful smiles, fathers clapping with pride, siblings cheering names they had grown up hearing. For a brief second, Ethan wondered if Douglas had come. He hadn't told him about the ceremony directly. Linda had weeks earlier, but Ethan hadn't asked whether his father would attend. He hadn't expected it. A part of him had stopped expecting that kind of gesture long ago. The speakers began, one after another. A university dean spoke about resilience and research. A guest scientist described the importance of inquiry in an uncertain world. A fellow graduate shared the journey of academic struggle and personal triumph. Each speech reminded Ethan of his own battles, silent, stubborn, unseen. As names were called and graduates stepped across the stage, he clapped politely, his mind slowly building toward the moment he would hear his name. When the announcer finally said, "Ethan Douglas Carter, Doctor of Philosophy and Biomedical Sciences," he stood and walked toward the platform with calm precision. The applause rose around him, and in that instant, he scanned the crowd. He expected to see only a blur of faces, but one face stood out. Douglas was seated near the middle, not in the front, not in the back. His shoulders were straighter than Ethan had seen in years. He wasn't clapping, but his hands were resting on his knees, and his eyes, sharp, familiar, were wet. He was crying, quietly, without shame. Ethan froze for a half-second as he stepped onto the stage. His father's face, weathered and stern, had always been the portrait of restraint. But now, in this sea of celebration, he looked different, smaller, softer, and more human than Ethan had ever allowed himself to believe. The diploma was placed in Ethan's hand, followed by a firm handshake from the department head. He nodded politely, stepped off the stage, and returned to his seat, his mind spinning, not from the moment itself, but from what he had just witnessed. Douglas had come. He had watched the whole thing, and he had cried. After the ceremony, the graduates poured into the open courtyard, where families clustered for photos, laughter, and long embraces. Linda found him first, pulling him into a tight hug and whispering congratulations. She beamed with pride, her voice trembling as she told him how proud she was. Then she stepped aside and nodded in the direction behind him. Ethan turned, and Douglas stood there alone, holding a program in one hand, his other hand resting loosely at his side. For a few seconds, they said nothing, just looked at each other, father and son, no longer divided by silence or disappointment. Douglas was the first to speak. "I read your name in the program," he said. "Dr. Ethan Carter." Ethan managed a small smile. "That's what it says." Douglas nodded, eyes still searching his son's face. "I wasn't sure if I should come." Ethan shrugged. "You didn't have to." "I know," Douglas said, "but I wanted to." Another silence passed between them, but it was no longer heavy. It was thoughtful, even necessary. Ethan didn't need an apology, not anymore. What he needed and what he had just received was a sign, simple, understated, and profound, that his father had seen him. Not as a failure, not as a disappointment, but as someone who had earned his place in the world. After a moment, Douglas looked at the diploma case in Ethan's hand. "That's a lot of pages behind one piece of paper," he said. "It is," Ethan replied. "You kept going," Douglas said, almost to himself. "Even when it looked like you shouldn't." Ethan nodded. "Because I had to." Douglas exhaled slowly. I didn't think you would, not back then. I know. I was wrong. The words landed softly but with weight. Ethan didn't need more than that. The years of silence, the pressure, the lack of support, it wouldn't all be undone in one afternoon. But this was a beginning, something unspoken finally finding its way to the surface. They stood side by side, watching the crowd for a while. No one rushed to fill the silence. For once, it felt like neither of them needed to. As the sun dipped behind the university's library tower, Ethan glanced at his father. I used to think being called a failure would be the worst thing, he said, but it's not. Douglas turned toward him. No? No. The worst thing would have been believing it. Douglas said nothing, but the look in his eyes shifted. Regret, perhaps, or pride, disguised in the only way he knew how to show it. They posed for a photo together, just the two of them. Linda took it, her hands steady, her eyes shining. Ethan stood with his diploma held at his side, Douglas with his arm resting lightly on his son's shoulder. The photo captured a moment that had taken years to reach, not a resolution of everything, but a turning point. A quiet agreement between a father and son who had spent most of their lives misunderstanding each other, only to discover that pride could be shown in silence, and love didn't always require words. The weeks that followed the commencement ceremony passed in a kind of soft blur for Ethan. Graduation parties were held, photographs circulated, and congratulatory messages trickled in from classmates, professors, and distant relatives. But amid all the external celebration, Ethan found himself in a quiet, reflective state. He had crossed the finish line of a journey so long and winding that even now, holding a doctoral degree in biomedical sciences, it still didn't seem entirely real. After the ceremony, Douglas didn't suddenly become expressive or affectionate. He remained largely reserved, his words measured, his presence calm but firm. Yet something had changed, something subtle, yet unmistakable. Where once there had been silence, now there was space. Space for acknowledgement, for the occasional comment, for a presence that didn't feel like judgment anymore, but something closer to respect. One evening, a few weeks after the ceremony, Ethan returned home for a visit. Linda had made his favorite dinner, and they sat around the kitchen table, not as parent and child caught in years of unspoken disappointment, but as three people gradually learning how to exist together without the weight of old wounds pressing between them. After dinner, Douglas asked Ethan if he wanted to see the old garage again, the one where they had once worked in silence, fixing a lawnmower that never quite ran right. Ethan agreed. The garage hadn't changed much. Tools still hung with surgical precision, and the scent of oil and wood still lingered in the air. They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by echoes of a time that felt both distant and painfully recent. Douglas picked up a wrench from the bench and turned it slowly in his hands. I used to think that fixing things was the only way to prove I was useful, he said quietly. When something was broken, I'd take it apart, figure out what went wrong, and put it back together. Ethan didn't interrupt. He sensed this wasn't just about tools. But people aren't like machines, Douglas continued. You can't tighten a bolt or replace a part and expect everything to work again. There was a long pause. I didn't know how to fix what I saw in you when you were younger, he said. So I treated you like a problem, like something that needed correction. Ethan listened, his chest tightening. You weren't a problem, Douglas said. You were just a boy trying to understand the world in a way I never did. It wasn't a grand apology, it wasn't polished or rehearsed, but it was real, and it was more than Ethan had ever expected to hear. He looked at his father, saw the lines etched deeper than they had been a decade earlier, the gray in his hair, the weight in his shoulders. I didn't need fixing, Ethan said gently. I just needed time. Douglas nodded. And you used it well. They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed its nature. No longer a wall, it had become a bridge. A quiet acknowledgement of what had passed and what could still be built. Over the following months, Ethan began his postdoctoral fellowship at a major research hospital. The work was demanding, complex, and deeply rewarding. He focused on cellular regeneration and tissue repair, contributing to studies that might one day help heal spinal injuries and degenerative diseases. He spent his days in labs, surrounded by microscopes, data charts, and sterile equipment. Yet even as he handled the most advanced technology, he never lost the grounding memory of where he had started. Back in a middle school bedroom with 3 plant pots and a borrowed desk lamp, the gap between where he had been and where he stood now filled him with a sense of quiet awe. It wasn't pride in the traditional sense, it was something gentler, a kind of reverence for the journey, for the setbacks that taught him how to recover, for the failures that demanded he grow, for the silence that forced him to find his own voice. Linda visited often, bringing groceries and checking in on his schedule. They had developed a rhythm of small conversations and long hugs. Douglas came less frequently, but when he did, the visits were meaningful. They spoke about Ethan's work, about articles they had read, about the nature of persistence. Douglas never pretended to understand the science, but he listened, and when he asked questions, they came not from skepticism, but from curiosity. That change, though small, meant everything. Ethan kept the photo from his graduation on his desk, the one where he and his father stood side by side. It reminded him of how far they had both come, not just in distance, but in understanding. That single frame held years of struggle, silence, and the quiet rebuilding of something that had once seemed irreparably broken. Ms. Reynolds, now retired, remained in touch through occasional letters and emails. In one message, she wrote, "You were never the sum of your report cards. You were the sum of your resilience." Ethan printed that line and pinned it above his desk. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in his apartment, he found the notebook he had once used to document his thoughts. The pages were yellowing, but the handwriting was still sharp. He flipped through it slowly, rereading the questions he had once asked in the dark. Why do I always mess up math? Why does Dad only talk when I do something wrong? Can I still be something if I'm not what he wants? He paused on a page he had written years earlier, the ink faint but legible. I'll show him I'm not a failure. He smiled faintly, not because he had proved his father wrong, but because he no longer needed to. The journey had never been about disproving someone else's belief. It had been about building his own. He turned to the final page of the notebook, which he had left blank. Picking up a pen, he wrote a new sentence. Being seen is powerful, but learning to see yourself is even more. As he closed the notebook and placed it back in the box, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. The boy who had once cried himself to sleep had become a man who understood the power of persistence, of self-belief, and of quiet, steady growth. The resolution hadn't come in one sweeping moment. It had unfolded piece by piece, like petals opening to the sun, and it wasn't finished yet. The seasons shifted, and with them Ethan's life settled into a rhythm he never would have imagined as a child. The hospital where he now worked had become more than a workplace. It was a place where science met humanity, where questions led to answers, and where even uncertainty had a place in progress. Each day began with early lab meetings and ended late with data analysis, patient charts, or quiet moments staring through a microscope. The hours were long, the problems complex, and the outcomes often uncertain. But Ethan embraced the challenge. He had never expected life to be simple. What mattered was that he had earned the right to be where he stood, through persistence, not perfection. One evening, after finishing a presentation for a conference, Ethan sat alone in the research library. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. His laptop glowed in front of him, but he wasn't typing. Instead, he stared at the final slide, a photo of a stem cell under magnification, pulsing with potential. Underneath, a single line, "Growth is a process we choose, again and again." The words felt truer than ever. He thought of every version of himself that had existed along the way. The overwhelmed middle schooler, the underestimated high school student, the determined college transfer, the sleepless graduate student. None of them had known exactly where they were going, but all of them had chosen to keep going. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from Linda. "Your father and I are heading out now. Should be there in about 20 minutes. They were coming to attend a small celebration the hospital was hosting in honor of the research team's latest published study." Ethan hadn't expected his parents to come. He hadn't asked, but Linda had heard about the event and insisted on it. Douglas, to Ethan's surprise, agreed without resistance. When they arrived, Ethan greeted them near the hospital's conference wing. Linda embraced him immediately, eyes proud and bright. Douglas followed, slower, quieter. He wore a blazer, one Ethan hadn't seen in years, and though his face showed little emotion, His eyes carried something deeper, a settled respect, a kind of unspoken acceptance. He shook Ethan's hand without hesitation, a gesture that no longer felt distant. It felt deliberate. The event itself was brief. A handful of speeches, a slideshow, some light refreshments. Ethan's supervisor spoke about the team's dedication and mentioned Ethan by name when discussing the breakthroughs they had achieved. As applause echoed through the room, Ethan glanced at his parents. Linda smiled through tears. Douglas gave a small nod, his arms crossed, but his posture relaxed in a way Ethan had learned to recognize. Later that night, back at his apartment, Ethan offered his parents coffee before they left. As Douglas walked through the living room, he paused near a shelf filled with books and mementos. A photo caught his eye, the graduation picture, the two of them standing together. He picked it up slowly, studying it. "You ever think about how different it could have been?" Douglas asked, voice low. Ethan looked over. "I do. A lot." Douglas set the photo back down. "I said things I shouldn't have. Did things that didn't help." Ethan waited. "I thought pushing you would make you stronger," Douglas continued. "But I didn't see how strong you already were." There was a long pause. Then Ethan responded, "I thought proving myself would make you see me differently." "And did it?" Douglas asked. Ethan considered the question carefully. "It made me see myself differently," he said. "And that was what I needed most." Douglas didn't reply immediately. But when he finally looked at Ethan, there was a softness in his eyes, one that had taken years to surface. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not just for this." He gestured around the apartment, the degrees, the accolades, but for not quitting when it would have been easier to. Those words landed heavier than applause, heavier than any letter of acceptance or academic recognition. They were not just praise, they were an offering, a bridge rebuilt piece by piece over years of silence and tension. The next morning, Ethan stood alone by the window, watching the early light creep across the city. He thought of that night long ago, when he had whispered into the darkness that he would prove he wasn't a failure. That boy, so uncertain and fragile, had believed success would come in a single moment, a report card, a trophy, a nod of approval. But life had taught him otherwise. Success wasn't loud. It didn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looked like quietly continuing. Sometimes it looked like showing up even when no one clapped. Sometimes it looked like forgiving someone who didn't know how to say sorry. Ethan picked up his phone and opened his old notes app. There, buried among early drafts of essays and reminders, was a quote he had saved from his time at the community college. "Not all roots are visible, but they're always working, deep below." He smiled. It felt fitting. Later that week, he was asked to speak to a group of high school students visiting the hospital. As he stood in front of the group, kids not much younger than he'd been when he first felt the sting of being underestimated, he shared his story, not with drama or embellishment, but with honesty. He spoke about failure, doubt, growth, and perseverance. He told them that life would not always reward them on time, that sometimes the journey would be longer than they wanted, harder than they expected. But that didn't make it less worthwhile. After the talk, one student approached him and asked, "Did you ever feel like giving up?" Ethan nodded. "Many times." "So why didn't you?" He paused, then answered, "Because I realized that the version of me who kept going would eventually become someone I could be proud of, and I didn't want to miss meeting him." That night, back in the quiet of his apartment, Ethan looked again at the photo of his graduation. The boy his father once called a failure had become a man his father now respected. But more importantly, that boy had become someone who no longer needed permission to believe in himself. He whispered the words he once thought he'd never be able to say with peace in his heart. "I guess failures do get PhDs." And with that, he turned off the lights, sat at his desk, and kept going.